In the previous lecture, we learned about the roller coaster ride that leverage can take you on. In this lecture, let's come back to the hopefully safer world of bond investing. In the lecture where I introduced bonds, we learned about the huge variety of bonds that are available for investors. Although it's great to have a choice, we all know that too much choice can be bewildering. Given that you'll want to add some bonds to your portfolio either now or sometime in the future, how do you pick out the ones that are best for you from among the literally thousands of different ones on the market? Well, that's what this lecture is all about. There are a few big issues you should think about when it comes to bond selection, including default risk, inflation, and taxes. Your attitude towards these issues will help narrow down your choices to a manageable set. When you see some specific details about how these risks affect your bond investments and what types of bonds can effectively mitigate these risks, I think that it becomes a lot easier to make up your mind about the kinds of bonds that you'll want to hold. So in this lecture, I'm still thinking about bond investing from the standpoint of a buy and hold investor. In the introductory lecture on bonds, we learned about the strategy of building a bond ladder. So this lecture is partly about picking the bonds that you'll want to include in your bond ladder. We'll learn about some other ways to invest in bonds too in a future lecture. The first big issue that you'll need to think about as a bond investor is default risk, the risk that the borrower won't be able to pay back all the promised principal and interest payments. When we think of default, most of us immediately assume the borrower won't make any more payments and the bond becomes worthless. But this is rarely the case. Sometimes a default event is simply a missed bond payment that the borrower makes up after a while. And in many cases, defaults lead to rescheduled payments, not a permanent stop in payments. Nonetheless, as I've mentioned before, a default is going to dramatically reduce the value of your bonds, and it can make it difficult to sell them because only specialized investors are interested in buying defaulted bonds. So the big question is, how do you evaluate the probability of default on a bond? Companies called rating agencies specialize in evaluating bonds, and they give out ratings based on the likelihood of full and on-time repayment of interest and principal. There are actually lots of ratings agencies in the markets, but there are only 10 that have been recognized by the SEC and are called nationally recognized statistical rating organizations. And out of these 10, there are 3 really dominant players: Moody's, Standard & Poor's, known simply as S&P, and Fitch. Most bonds are rated by at least one of these firms, and in most cases they carry ratings from 2 or more firms. I'll talk mostly about Moody's and S&P, since these 2 firms tend to rate most of the bonds that you'll be interested in. The rating agencies use a system of letters, along with pluses and minuses, to distinguish between the different qualities of borrowers. Moody's uses a system of capital and lowercase letters, while S&P uses all capital letters. I tell my students that you can always remember who gave the rating because Moody's has both capital and lowercase letters in its name and uses a mix of capital and lowercase letters in its ratings. S&P, like its nickname, only uses capital letters in its ratings. It's important to realize that the rating system is not intended to correspond to any specific probabilities of default. Rather, these are just overall indications of the likelihood of full and timely repayment of promised interest and principal. The rating agencies have verbal interpretations of what the ratings mean, and I'll mention a few of them as I talk about the rating scale. Now here's a table that compares the bond ratings that Moody's and S&P use. At the top of the rating scale is the so-called AAA rating, which is 3 capital A's for S&P and 1 capital A and 2 lowercase a's for Moody's. S&P defines the AAA rating as, quote, extremely strong capacity to meet financial commitments, end quote. Note again that there's no promise of probabilities here, just a verbal characterization. As we go down the scale, the characterization of ratings goes to very strong capacity at AA, strong capacity at single A, and then finally adequate capacity to meet financial commitments at S&P's BBB rating, which corresponds in this case to a rating of Baa from Moody's. Note that the BBB rating is only associated with adequate financial capacity. Because this is the lowest rating with at least adequate financial capacity, the BBB bonds are regarded as the lowest so-called investment grade rating. This means that institutional investors like pension funds, who are charged with investing on behalf of their clients in their best interests, are often prohibited from investing in any bonds with lower ratings than BBB or BAA. S&P refers to lower rated bonds as speculative grade. This implies that anything rated BB or lower needs at least a little luck in order to meet all of their financial obligations. Bonds rated BB or single B basically look okay for the short term, but are vulnerable to a downturn in general economic conditions or in their own specific business. Bonds rated in the C range are actually dependent on favorable economic conditions in order to be able to make their promised payments. And below the C ratings is only D, which stands for, you guessed it, default. All this information about the bond ratings does give a pretty good indication of the likelihood of default. But wouldn't it be nice to have some hard numbers to compare? Well, the rating agencies do collect statistics on the actual default rates that bonds in various ratings categories experience, and we'll look at some of those now. The first set of statistics that I'll show you is what is called the cumulative default rates in each ratings category for corporate bonds. This is simply the fraction of all bonds in each rating category that have ever defaulted. Notice that the default rate runs from only 0.5% to just under 3% in the A categories, then jumps to between 10 and 50% in the B categories, to just under 70% in the C categories. Now, this isn't a default probability because it's showing you the fraction of all bonds over a very long period of time that have ever defaulted. But it does give you an indication of the amount of risk that you'll take on if you maintain a ladder of bonds in a certain ratings category for a long period, say 30 years or more. If you still want to see numbers that look more like real default probabilities, and if you're anything like me, you do, then I can show you these statistics as well. These are the average annual default rates between 1981 and 2008 of all corporate bonds around the world that were rated by S&P. So these numbers can be interpreted much more like the probability that a bond of a certain rating will default in a given year. Notice that the annual probability of default runs from virtually 0 to only 0.25% for the investment grade bonds over this period. But the annual default rate jumps up to between 1 and 10% per year for bonds in the BB and single B range. And then it jumps up to over 20% per year for bonds in the C range. I hope that this gives you a good understanding of what you're getting yourself into when you invest in corporate bonds of various ratings. Basically, if you buy and hold a bond rated below investment grade, you're looking at a chance of at least 1% per year that this bond will default. And if you hold a series of below investment grade bonds for a long period, then your chance of experiencing defaults on these bonds goes way up. The BBB bonds don't do too badly in terms of annual probability of default, but it seems like the defaults manage to catch up over long periods, as we see in that cumulative default rate of about 10%. But the A range features not only low annual default probabilities, generally lower than 0.1%, but also a very low rate of defaults over longer time horizons as well. Now, you as an investor will have to balance these default probabilities against the higher returns that lower rated bonds promise. It may be worth it to you to invest in a ladder of BBB corporate bonds because the increase in yield over, say, AA bonds is too high to pass up even when you consider the default risk. On the other hand, if you think about the amount of money that you'll have locked up in your bonds, you may find that even a long-run default rate of 1% is too high. You may think that if you're the unlucky one, the damage to your portfolio will be too much to recover from. And that's a perfectly legitimate concern. I certainly think that building a bond ladder out of corporate bonds isn't for everyone. Of course, you may think that those AAA bonds don't seem too bad. Why not build a bond ladder out of those? Well, that's a great idea, until you realize how few AAA corporations there are. As I speak, there are only 4 AAA-rated corporations in the U.S., so a AAA bond ladder may not be very diversified, which is also a concern. There does seem to be a much greater supply of AA rated bonds, however, which are certainly worth thinking about as a source of a corporate bond ladder. So, if you are hoping to find a safe and attractive corporate bond to invest in, you may be pretty disappointed. Or maybe you're skeptical. Surely you think huge and successful corporations like McDonald's and Intel must offer bonds that are quite safe. Well, the answer is that they do, but the bonds are special ones, called commercial paper. Commercial paper is a special kind of corporate bond. It's unsecured, which means that it isn't backed by collateral. And it has very short maturity. Most of the commercial paper out there has a maturity of less than 270 days, and the vast majority of it has a maturity of less than 3 months. But commercial paper is a quite safe corporate bond. Only the largest and financially strongest firms are able to issue commercial paper, and defaults on the highest rated commercial paper are extremely rare. Of course, there's always a catch, and with commercial paper, there are two. One of them you've probably already guessed. Since commercial paper is a very short-term instrument, it usually pays a very low rate of interest. And second, there's a little matter of a minimum investment. The typical minimum size of a commercial paper lot is $1 million. So this effectively puts direct investment in commercial paper out of the reach of most individual investors. But there are two ways for you to get access to investments that are similar to commercial paper. One way is to look for the longer-term version of commercial paper, which is called medium-term notes, or MTNs for short. You can find MTNs on most bond brokers' websites. You just need to keep in mind that MTNs are rated like bonds and will probably have the same default track record as bonds. The other way to get access to commercial paper is by investing in a money market mutual fund. A money market mutual fund is a type of mutual fund that invests the shareholders' deposits in short-term, high-quality bonds such as treasury bills and commercial paper. These mutual funds were actually started in the 1970s to evade restrictions on bank deposit rates, known as deposit rate ceilings. They flourished then and continue to do so now because they can invest in commercial paper and earn interest rates that are usually significantly better than short-term bank deposit rates. Money market funds, as they're called, also offer the same types of conveniences as bank deposit accounts, such as access to ATM withdrawals and automatic bill paying. It's important to realize that money market funds are not bank deposit accounts, though. The way that they work is that investors buy shares in the mutual fund where each share costs $1. The money market fund's managers take the cash from the investors and buy short-term bonds like T-bills and commercial paper. As these bonds pay interest, the money market fund passes along this interest to the investors in terms of new shares in the mutual fund. So if I invest $1,000 into a money market fund, I'll own 1,000 shares of the fund. If the interest rate earned on the fund is 2% per year, then at the end of the year, I'll own 1,020 shares in the fund, where each share is still worth $1 each. Now, since money market mutual funds are not bank accounts, they're not insured like bank deposits are. But their safety is supported by two mechanisms. First, there are some clear and strict SEC rules about the types of assets that money market mutual funds are allowed to invest in. Rule 2A7, for example, lays out that money market mutual funds must hold high-quality bonds of no more than 13 months of maturity, and the average maturity of the entire fund can't be longer than 60 days. In addition, the main priority of the fund must be preservation of asset value at $1 per share rather than capital appreciation. The second mechanism is an informal bailout commitment on the part of the managers of the money market mutual funds. The companies that offer money market mutual funds usually offer many other mutual funds as well, which earn far more management fees than the money market mutual funds do. These fund management companies initially attract investors to their products through the money market mutual fund. So money market funds bring customers in the door. The idea is that if the shareholders can't trust the money market fund, then they surely won't trust this company with their other investments. So the money market fund managers have a big incentive to make sure that the money market fund fulfills its obligations, even if the managers have to pay out of their own pockets to keep the fund on its feet. For example, In 1997, a small finance company named Mercury Finance defaulted on its low-rated commercial paper. This commercial paper promptly lost 25% of its market value. A money market fund operated by Strong Capital Management was a big holder of the Mercury Finance commercial paper. And then the managers of the fund bought all the commercial paper from the fund with their own money at its pre-default value of $180 million. This example shows that even though money market mutual funds aren't federally insured, there are good reasons to believe that they're very safe investments. Of course, when you invest in a money market mutual fund, you need to be very careful about what the fund tells you about the types of commercial paper that it will invest in. Some money market funds only invest in T-bills, and of course, this is very safe. The downside is that the returns on these funds are fairly low. Money market funds increase the returns they offer by buying higher-yielding commercial paper, which is fine if the paper carries a high rating, known as A1 or P1 by the respective rating agencies. But some money market funds try to further juice their returns by allowing themselves to invest in low-rated commercial paper, and that's really where the risk lies. So if you're tempted by a money market mutual fund that's returning a bit more than all the other funds, then you really need to investigate what the fund is holding. And you need to ask yourself whether the few extra hundredths of a percent are really worth the extra risk that the managers won't be able to bail out the fund in case a lot of their holdings default. The low returns on most money market mutual funds also mean that they're really a substitute for holding cash, not really a great long-term investment. But there are circumstances where you might find yourself storing your cash in a money market fund for a longer period of time. For example, you may liquidate an investment and not know right away where to reinvest the money. Or returns on long-term bonds may be so low that they don't justify locking up the money for that long, and you want to wait and see whether interest rates will start to rise in the future. And of course, most experts remind us that we do need to have an emergency fund of cash in case of some financial disaster in our lives, like a layoff. In all these cases, money market mutual funds can be very attractive vehicles for storing cash for extended periods. For longer-term fixed income investments, though, you'll eventually want to find longer maturity bonds that have the risk-return profile attractive to you. And the fact is that corporate bonds just aren't going to be attractive to everyone. So we should consider the alternative, government bonds. As we learned in the introductory lecture on government bonds, or on bonds, there's a surprisingly large and diverse set of government bond issuers out there. These days, even governments are rated by the major rating agencies, so you can use these ratings as a guide. But although the lettering system is the same, the letters don't quite carry the same meaning, because a government's willingness and ability to pay its debts is influenced by a different set of economic and political factors than corporate debt is. Nonetheless, the spirit of the ratings on government debt is about the same as corporate ratings, so I think it's okay to interpret them in about the same way. With high-quality government debt, like U.S. Treasuries, the risk of default virtually goes to zero. So you have other considerations to think about. And the main one in my mind is inflation. I've discussed inflation a couple of other times in previous lectures, so I won't repeat any information about the damage that inflation can do. Instead, I want to consider the choice you have to invest in government debt that carries at least some explicit inflation protection. The basic idea of a bond whose interest rate rises with inflation is actually a pretty old one, though these bonds haven't been around all that long in the U.S. The general term for such a bond is an indexed bond, in the sense that the return is somehow indexed to inflation. In the U.S., we have government bonds called Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, or TIPS, as well as a series of inflation-indexed U.S. savings bonds. Other countries, such as the U.K., also offer inflation-indexed government bonds. Well, how do TIPS work? Basically, the principal of the bond is adjusted for inflation. For example, if the bond has a $10,000 principal or par value at the start of the year and inflation is 3% annually, then at the end of the year, the bond principal will rise to $10,300. The reason the inflation adjustment is done in this way is so that the interest rate on the bond can stay constant. This seems to be mostly a matter of clarity and convenience for investors. The quoted interest rate on TIPS is the inflation-adjusted or real interest rate that the bond pays. Your total increase in value will depend on both the inflation rate as well as the inflation-adjusted rate the bond pays. Well, let me give you an example to show how this works. Suppose you buy a Treasury inflation-protected security with an initial principal value of $10,000, and the interest rate on the bond is fixed at 2% per year. If inflation is 3% over the course of the first year, then the Treasury marks up the principal on the bond to $10,300 at the end of the year. Then, during the next year, the Treasury pays you 2% interest based on the new principal of $10,300. So during the second year, you'll get 2% of $10,300, which is $206 in interest. Note that we have to find out what the inflation rate is before the Treasury marks up the principal of the bond. That can't be avoided. Any inflation index security is going to face some kind of delay based on the fact that we have to wait to measure the actual inflation. Now, here are a few more details about TIPS that you ought to know. First, in my example, I pretended that the inflation adjustment occurs only once per year to keep it simple. But the inflation is actually measured monthly, and the interest adjustment actually happens twice per year, which is better for you. Second, TIPS will decrease the principal if there is deflation, so that the interest payment will fall if the consumer price index actually falls. But at maturity, the Treasury will repay either the adjusted principal or the original principal, whichever is higher. That means that even though deflation may decrease the interest payments you receive, the principal you actually receive is protected against deflation. Finally, TIPS are actually quite affordable. Unlike other government bonds, TIPS can be purchased in increments of only $100. Now, there is an alternative to TIPS offered by the U.S. Treasury called I-bonds. I-bonds are inflation index savings bonds, and they can be purchased directly through Treasury Direct as well as through banks. I-bonds are even more affordable than TIPS since the minimum purchase is only $25. But they don't adjust as rapidly to inflation, and they have some other restrictions as well. For example, individuals are only allowed to purchase $5,000 worth of I-bonds per year, whereas they can purchase up to $5 million per year in TIPS. Of course, TIPS do have a couple of potential downsides that you should also be aware of. First, there's the amount of the real return on TIPS. TIPS are longer-term bonds. They're only available in maturities of 5, 10, and 30 years. So when the TIPS are issued in the market, the promised rate of interest is largely driven by fears about how high inflation is going to be over the next 5, 10, and 30 years. When people get more worried about inflation, they flock into TIPS, which drives the price up and the promised interest rate down. And when inflation fears calm down, investors buy other bonds instead, so the promised rate on TIPS rises and the price of TIPS falls. This leads to two potential problems. First, if you buy TIPS during a time when there's a lot of fear for future inflation, then the promised returns on TIPS will be very low. And second, if you have to sell your TIPS before they reach maturity, then you can suffer a capital loss on your TIPS just like you can on any other bond. How does the inflation protection in TIPS stack up against the inflation protection in normal government bonds? Well, when a regular Treasury bond is issued, its interest rate is influenced by the amount of inflation that is expected to occur over the life of the bond. In fact, there's a well-known rule of thumb in economics called the Fisher effect that captures this relationship. The Fisher effect says that the interest rate on any bond is the sum of the real rate of interest plus the expected annual inflation over the life of the bond. So when you buy a regular bond that isn't adjusted for inflation, you're hoping, or rather betting, that inflation will be less than or equal to what the market expects it to be. But if inflation rises unexpectedly, you'll lose value. With TIPS, on the other hand, you know that you'll get compensated for whatever inflation occurs over the life of the bond. There won't be any nasty inflation surprises. But the price you pay for that certainty may be that the inflation-adjusted return is lower than the inflation-adjusted return on a regular Treasury bond. And the problem is, you won't know for sure until the bonds mature. So the choice is really about risk. Do you want to take the risk that inflation will be higher than expected, or do you want to get rid of that risk? That depends on your own feelings about risk, as well as how you personally expect the markets and the economy to perform well into the future. Well, so far we've talked about default risk and inflation risk. The final aspect of bonds that may help you narrow down your choice is tax treatment. Bonds are one of the few types of investments that receive potential tax exemption, and for some investors this is an attractive feature. For example, interest on Treasury bonds is exempt from state and local income taxes, though the interest is taxed by the federal government and capital gains are taxable as well. But it's municipal bonds that carry the biggest potential tax advantage, since the interest payments on many issues are exempt from federal income taxes. Because of this tax advantage, the interest rates paid on municipal bonds are always lower than the rates paid on fully taxable bonds. The question, of course, is how much lower? Now, depending on your tax rate, you could still end up better off on an after-tax basis by investing in a municipal bond with a lower interest rate than in a fully taxable bond that pays a higher interest rate. To find out whether any bond that pays tax-exempt interest is worth investing in, there's an easy way to compare the interest rate on a tax-exempt bond with the rate on a taxable bond. Simply take the interest rate promised on the tax-exempt bond and divide that rate by 1 minus the tax rate that you would otherwise have to pay on the interest if it were taxable. The answer to that calculation tells you the equivalent taxable interest rate that you're earning on the bond. For example, if the municipal bond is paying a 5% interest rate and your income tax rate is 35% of any taxable interest earned, then the equivalent taxable interest rate is 5 divided by the quantity 1 minus 0.35, which gives 7.69%. This is the rate that you should compare to other taxable bonds that you're also considering. Now, as my example suggests, this is most relevant to investors who are in the top income tax brackets. In fact, the market interest rates on municipal bonds are usually driven by the investors in the top brackets. The rates get driven just to the point where the high-tax investors are indifferent between tax-exempt and taxable bonds. So investors in lower tax brackets probably won't find these bonds worthwhile. In addition, you should remember that municipal bonds also carry default risk, even though most are highly rated. Although there hasn't been a default by a U.S. state in the post-war era, there have been a number of localities that have defaulted on their municipal bonds. So pay attention to those ratings and do your homework on the borrower, just like you would for a corporate bond. Well, in this lecture, we learned that there are 3 big issues that can really help you narrow down your bond selection. You'll notice that I started with default risk, because I think that this is really the big decision you need to make as a bond investor. I think it's wise to use ratings as an initial guide, just like we use financial ratios to identify good stocks. But you need to do your own homework on any risky borrower whose bonds you're thinking of buying. Then, consider how you want to handle inflation. There are good alternatives out there to fixed-rate bonds, though the certainty they offer does come at the cost of a lower promised yield. But there's no need to expose yourself to inflation risk if you don't want to. And finally, if you're in one of the top income tax brackets, you also want to think about investing in tax-exempt bonds, especially munis. Hopefully, this lecture gives you a compass for navigating that ocean of bonds out there. Given how important it is to move your riskier investments into bonds at some point in your investing lifetime, you'll have to sail across the sea eventually. But now I think you have the tools to make it a safe and pleasant voyage.